Brighton turned out to be a peaceful town. It was the same as it always was, with pretty girls in short skirts walking the streets, fluttering in the fresh sea breeze. They looked at all the men passing by with a contemptuous grimace. Don't consider me a baby, but get to know me, I don't mind. Little dark-haired waitresses in the same darn stockings and worn aprons served tea in the little restaurants on the waterfront. The hotels were full and the beaches were packed. It was hard to imagine that just 100 miles away, brutal battles were being fought, and the great one-act drama of Dunkirk was being played out. The only reminders of war were the presence of soldiers and barbed wire. The vacation flew by too quickly, as all vacations tend to do. All day long I lay on the beach with Eva and another girl named Doreen, who worked in the same troupe. The production of Come Out to Play had already had its first run before London, and now their star, Jesse Matthew, was up to his neck in trying to perfect it. I hadn't seriously encountered the stagehands before, but now that I've gotten to know them better, I can say they're nice guys, especially in the evenings when the bars open. On the last night, we were out for a little walk with Eva and her friend when suddenly the air raid alarm sounded. Somewhere in the distance bombs began to burst, a couple of guns opened fire, and flares hung in the sky. So we all went to the bar to have a few drinks and wait for the commotion to die down. As usual, the bar was full of people. Everyone had gathered to listen to the 9 o'clock news. While we were standing there, an army officer came out of the crowd. He looked at me so strangely that he could have been mistaken for a madman. At first I thought he had had too much to drink and prepared for a drunken brawl. But he wasn't drunk. He had just arrived from Dunkirk this morning after spending 4 days at the beachhead, so it was easy to imagine the state he was in. When his lips started moving, I didn't immediately realize what he was saying. And then for the first, but far from the last time, I heard a bitter rebuke. Where was the Royal Air Force at Dunkirk? I don't know. Weren't they there? I stupidly replied. They were there, and Heinkel's and Messers, but not our fighters. I only saw one Spitfire in 4 days. Maybe they were fighting elsewhere, I suggested. No, they weren't anywhere. We were bombed every hour. It was sheer hell. The bombs were hailing all around us, and there was nothing we could do. I let him talk. Sometimes his voice grew louder. Sometimes it became a barely audible whisper. It was like he was talking to himself. Suddenly a fanfare sounded from the radio, and Bruce Dulfrage began to read out the news. But this officer kept muttering something, no longer realizing what was disturbing the others. Finally, one old man, who had been waiting for the foreign news, rose and took him by the arm. "Don't you realize we're listening to the news?" he said politely, confident that the others would back him up. The army officer blinked confusedly. He just didn't understand what was going on. I noticed several glances thrown at me, and my blood boiled. I managed to drink a couple of cocktails, and that was enough. I turned off the radio, and the room was suddenly quiet. Then I turned to the old man. "Listen, you old bastard, do you realize that while you're sitting here on your fat ass eating, someone is fighting so they don't snap your fucking neck?" I said it quietly, but everyone in the bar heard. "Do you realize that every minute bomber pilots risk their heads to delay Hitler's advance? That merchant seamen under cover of His Majesty's ships are trying to break through to England to bring you food. Just 100 miles away in Army, our British Army is trying to break out of a trap set by old shits like you. You just don't realize you're talking to a man who just came from there. He's seen more in a few days than you've seen in a lifetime. And all you want to do is sit here in perfect safety and listen to the news." Having made this unusually long speech, I was completely exhausted and had nothing more to add. So I gave the old man a distasteful glance and finished quietly. "I think, sir, that you're full of shit." Then I walked out, but at the door I could hear the army officer muttering. Where was the Air Force at Dunkirk? The next day, I said goodbye to Eva. She thought she was seeing me for the last time. There was a mass of tears, and I felt awkward. But the train moved on, and the station platform was left behind. I was very glad to be back, as it was not a good time for a vacation. The enemy would soon be only a few miles from our shores. Probably within a month he will endeavor to land in England, in which case everyone must do his duty. When we passed Grantham, I felt perfectly happy. When I arrived, the lads were sitting in the recreation room. Some looked awfully tired because they had made sorties 3 nights in a row. Nevertheless, there was the usual chorus of gruff greetings when I walked in. The tension had taken its toll on everyone. Jack Kinnock and Surgeon Ollison could clearly use a week's rest, but who could we be angry with? Our job was still relatively easy compared to what the sailors had to do. With the help of volunteers, the Navy managed to remove most of our defeated army from the coast of France within a week. And what to speak of the fighter squadrons of the Metropolitan Air Force, which made several sorties a day to keep the air umbrella over the English Channel. None of them slept. Only occasionally did they knock back a couple of cups of coffee and manage a hasty snack while the mechanics refueled and rearmed the planes. And then they'd take to the skies again. Suddenly I noticed that 2 familiar faces were missing. "Where are Ian and Grinny?" I asked. "Missing 2 days ago," someone replied. "How?" "Low altitude, Aachen." "Damn, and how did poor Dell take it?" "Pretty damned steadfast," the adjutant informed her. "Poor old Ian." "Yeah, tough luck." "Yeah." Suddenly Oscar burst in. "Heard the news, Gibbo?" he asked. He was always glad to meet someone back from vacation. "No, I haven't heard anything much." "Why?" "Churchill was speaking in the House of Commons. He said we had saved 335,000 people. I suppose that's very good, for it was previously thought that no more than 20,000 could be saved." Everyone spoke at once. "What does he think of King Leopold?" Jackie asked. "Thinks he's a cunt." Churchill didn't say that directly, but he did say that we should base our relations with him on the fact that he capitulated. That could mean anything. Politicians have their own language. "Yes, but I still think he will be treated badly. He asked for our help at the very last moment. If he had any brains at all, he would have fought us from the start." That was Tony. "The Army says the Royal Air Force washed its hands of us at Dunkirk. What does Churchill say about it?" Ollison asked, changing the subject of the conversation. "He says it was the circumstances. The fighter command boys were fighting a brutal battle a few miles away. What targets for German bombers could have been more attractive than the ships at Dunkirk? And I don't know what would have happened there if ours had let them operate quietly." But then I intervened. "I suppose a lot of bombers got through anyway. I met a fellow at Brighton who claimed to have seen only Germans." "That's quite understandable," Oscar remarked. "When the guys needed refueling, they had to make the long way to their bases. Anyway, the Germans had 3 times the numerical superiority, and some of the bombers broke through, of course." "Yeah, the Army's mad as hell at us," said Bill, who had just gotten up and was smoking his pipe. "I got back from Salisbury yesterday. The lads say the airmen can't be shown in pubs on their own. The Army men will beat up any man in a blue uniform." Well, you can't blame them. They'd scrambled hard. They'd been kicked out of Norway. They'd been punched in the face in France. What's next? God knows. First of all, they should get a firm grip. Yes, they've had it tight, Oscar agreed. This is the second time they've been thrown off the continent, which is bad enough in itself, but frankly, I don't see any faults. Most pilots like to speculate about grand strategy, and Oscar was no exception. He pulled out a cigarette case and began to make his point. In Norway, the enemy had too many airplanes. We don't have bases close enough to Norway to protect our troops. There were such bases this time, but we simply misused them and did not support our army, even ourselves. But we could have been outnumbered like flies. I objected. Yes, because we were supposed to be protected by fighters from the metropolis. But then the Luftwaffe would have been able to bomb London in peace. Maybe you're right, Oscar agreed. He liked to argue. Yes, we could have done a lot of things if we'd had troop support planes, but we didn't have them. The shortage of airplanes in general, and the shortage of the right types, dates back to the Swinton era. Back to the ground forces, however. In the first case, if those wretched neutrals had gone with us from the start, things might have turned out differently. But the same thing happened in Norway, put in Bill. That goes for all neutrals, Oscar said, lighting a cigarette. Then there was another snare. When the Germans invaded Belgium, our armies rushed to meet them. However, they were too late and failed to establish a reliable communications network. The Germans moved too fast. When the Germans captured Sedan and forced the Meuse, only a quick retreat straight to Amiens could save the situation. But Weygand thought he could hold the front and close the gap. However, most of our commanders were unfamiliar with a new type of warfare, blitzkrieg. One strong point after another passed into enemy hands under the combined blows of dive bombers and tanks. Moreover, French soldiers, at least some of them, surrendered at the slightest threat. And then came the stab in the back when King Leopold capitulated and left a gap 30 miles wide with no one to defend it. There was nothing we could do, and we rolled backwards, straight towards Dunkirk, suffering heavy casualties. I believe that 17 French divisions were captured, of course, the entire Belgian army, and I think about 30,000 of ours. If you estimate what happened as a whole, it was a complete rout. Of course, all that is true. But what will happen next? And this I do not know. Maybe the French will hold out while we assemble a new army. Maybe they will, but it won't be an easy job. Churchill says we've lost all the equipment. There was a long pause. We often discussed the course of the war. This was one of those evenings. The boys started to think of something clever to say. But then the door opened, and Willie came in. We jumped to our feet. "Sit down, boys." He was in a good mood. "Does anybody play decent pool or any other games that require dexterity?" Everyone remained silent as they didn't understand what he was getting at. "I need 2 volunteers," Willie continued, then jabbed his finger at Pete and me. "You and you." I snorted. What kind of game were we going to play? I wanted to fly, not play on the green cloth. When we went up to his office, Willie pulled out a small plasticine model. It was a miniature railroad tunnel. Now he was deadly serious and spoke calmly. "Today you are to conduct an experiment that Air Vice Marshal Harris has devised. As you know, things in France are going abominably badly, so he has decided to try to slow down the enemy's advance by disrupting his railroad communications. We'll leave the highway to the day bombers. As you know, the most vulnerable places on railroads are bridges and tunnels. The former are too solidly built to be destroyed, but the latter are much more vulnerable. That's why I asked if you play billiards. I want to know if you can put the ball in the hole. I need 2 guys who can roll a bomb into a tunnel where it will explode a few seconds later. Of course, we'll only block the railroad for a few days, but even that could seriously affect the delivery of supplies to the advancing German armies. It can be done in many places, and I leave the choice to you. Take off tonight at 10 o'clock. We had not yet left the office, and a satisfied smile spread across Pete's face. He didn't just play pool, he loved it with all his heart. We took off together, crossed the sea, left burned Rotterdam on the left, crossed Belgium, flew over darkened Brussels, and ended up over Germany. In reality, the light cloaking was more than bad. People waved torches at us. Then a searchlight beam appeared on the left and illuminated an airplane traveling at 13,000 feet. A barrage of shells from heavy anti-aircraft guns rained down on it. It was carrying lights on for some reason. We later learned that it was one of the pilots of a squadron who had simply forgotten to turn them off after takeoff. No wonder that he later said, "And it seemed to me that I was in the sky all alone." Carefully following the map from canal to canal, we eventually made our way to our tunnel near Aachen. But now the moon was already hidden, so I fired a flare. In its light, the outline of the tunnel entrance suddenly and sharply appeared. We had no extra time, as these rockets burned only about 3 minutes, so we immediately rushed into the peak. We raced along the tracks like a super-speed train. I guess my subconscious noted that the traffic lights were on. Then a cliff jerked up in front of us. We swerved to the right, and at the same time I dropped 2 500-pound bombs. We almost caught the tops of the trees with our wings, but we managed to soar upward. And a couple seconds later there was a rumble behind me, and I looked back and saw that the tunnel entrance had collapsed. That was just fine, because we still had 2 bombs left. As we flew to the next tunnel, located 10 miles from the first, we ran into a problem. The second flare refused to separate from the airplane. It was horrible. The night was impenetrably dark, and it was simply impossible to see anything. If the gunners had heard even a quarter of what was said to them, even they would have been ashamed. Eventually Waddy and I came up with a plan. We flew over the rails, keeping as low as possible, and then I turned on the landing light. It gave some semblance of a light path. At the same time, Waddy pointed ahead with Aldis's signal lamp, trying to find the entrance to the tunnel by its beam. The cliff slope was rushing toward us at 200 miles per hour. For several minutes we flew low over the gleaming strings of rails, and I prayed there wasn't a night fighter nearby. Some misguided soul suddenly fired a machine gun at us, but missed as the distance was over half a mile. And then, I see a tunnel. Stand by. Bombs dropped. After the word jettisoned, I pushed forward the throttle sectors and still had time to see the tunnel illuminated by the signal lamp, and then I jerked the handle toward me. The old Hampton, having disposed of the bombs, took off like an elevator, skidding over a 400-foot cliff just a few inches away. I remember it perfectly because it was a white limestone cliff. Then 11 seconds passed and a thud came, meaning we had done our thing. When we landed, it turned out that Pete was less nervous. He had returned an hour earlier, had a lot less adventure, and from my point of view, had worked out much better. Just as he saw the tunnel, a train was entering it. Pete quickly circled the rock and, with careful aim, plugged the tunnel exit. Then he returned to the entrance and blew it up, catching the train inside the mountain. What can I say? An entry appeared in my flight book, June 13, 1940. Hampton, L4070. Pilot. Gibson. Target. Bombing of Renta time. 7 hours, 15 minutes. It was one of those occasions when you are pushed almost to the limit. We were returning from a raid in which we had to bomb the German headquarters at Ghent. Usually on such occasions, after the attack, we would take a course southwest to be over the territory of unoccupied France in the afternoon, where there were no enemy fighters. Quite often we caused panic among the refugees who crowded all the roads. They wandered dejectedly southward to escape the Germans. When we found ourselves safely over unoccupied territory, we would turn directly to our base. In this case, however, we had bombed out rather early, and Watt had decided that we could fly straight back, as it was still dark. So we set a course straight for the base, that is, northwest. We soon ran into low clouds, and when we got through them, we came upon a concentration of anti-aircraft guns and searchlights. We thought this must be Dunkirk and turned directly west. As it got light, we pressed harder and harder against the ground, all nervously looking around for enemy fighters. We thought we were still over France, but the French coast was stubbornly unwilling to show itself. When it fully dawned, we suspected that the compass was lying, and turned northwest, deciding to keep our direction by the sun. We were now flying almost over the very tops of the trees, and all were fearfully nervous. Suddenly, an airfield appeared directly in our course. In desperation, I opened the flaps of the bomb hatch. If I was to land among the Kroats, at least I would have time to blow up some hangar, since we still had one bomb left. But at the very moment when my finger was ready to press the release button, I suddenly recognized the airfield. Yes, I recognized it. It was Harwell, and we were in England. I hastily closed the bomb hatch and immediately turned to a new course. An hour later, we returned to our base and discovered that we were exactly 3 hours late. Most people already thought we were finished. One Whitley pilot was less fortunate. He was in real trouble. He did almost everything I did, except he actually managed to drop a series of bombs on an English airfield. And at that very moment, both of his engines quit because he ran out of gasoline. He quickly landed his huge airplane on a potato field and hurriedly set it on fire, as was supposed in such cases. As the plane went up in flames, the pilot and his crew went to the nearest barn to sit there until darkness fell and then try to get away. Suddenly, a Royal Air Force staff car pulled up in front of them, and out of it flew a gleaming, galoomed colonel. He was watching the crew's movements through binoculars from the tower at the airfield and drove straight to the barn. They say that even the trees turned red when they heard what the colonel said, looking at the blazing Wheatley. However, the Germans also got into similar stories. One crew, obviously not the best, lost direction during a reconnaissance flight. At last, they got out towards South Wales, and in the moonlight saw the silvery waters of the Bristol Channel to the south. Aha! The channel at last, the navigator reported cheerfully. The pilot turned south, and after a while the Germans saw land. Here comes France. The navigator rejoiced even more. However, he was badly mistaken. It was North Devon. It was already quite dawn, and the Germans were flying quite low, as they were running out of fuel. So they landed at the first airfield they could find. A tired Army anti-aircraft gunner was sleeping on sandbags next to the landing strip, but the noise of the engines woke him up. He almost fainted when, at 6 a.m., a Ju-88 made a neat landing just a few meters away from him and began to taxi to the flight control center. The pilot was obviously going to run straight away to report to his superiors. He turned out to be a complete moron, that pilot. Still thinking he was in France, he got out of the plane and went to the control tower. The private standing at the stairs did not salute him, because he did not immediately understand what kind of uniform this man was wearing or what insignia he was seeing. The pilot berated him in exemplary German. The private seemed to be a fan of adventure movies and realized what was going on. He immediately drew his gun, and it was all over. Another man added to the long list of prisoners of war. There are probably many similar stories somewhere, but you won't hear them all until after the war. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. There were days when we were stretched to the limit and hardly slept at all. We were required to fly as often as possible, as many sorties as human beings could stand. So often villages in Lincolnshire and East Anglia would wake up at night to the roar of bombers going out and returning from a raid. It was with great sadness that we let our dear old Willie Snaith go. In his place arrived the new squadron commander, Sisson. He was a good-looking short guy who didn't like to talk much. At the same time, and the other squadron received a new commander by the name of Gillan. It was the same Gillan who in 1938 managed to fly from Scotland on a hurricane, which had a speed of 335 miles per hour, with an average speed of 408 miles per hour. For this, he earned the nickname Gillan the Sailwind. It was a strong personality, and it was hard to imagine a bigger difference than between this pair. Every day we did our best to slow down the German offensive, so Crosby lifted me as usual whether I flew at night or not. Getting a cup of tea was very satisfying, but his voice grew darker every day, and his face stretched more and more. Every day the same thing happened, only with slight variations. He was the living embodiment of pessimism. June 10. Italy has entered the war, sir. Shall I serve your breakfast, sir? June 12. Rouen has been captured, sir. Shall I serve your dress uniform, sir? May 14. Paris is captured, sir. You look a little tired this morning, sir. Sad days. Gloomy days. England had never before found herself in such a difficult position. It seemed as if our little country had to defend the whole world alone against fascist tyranny. On the evening of June 7, we heard Churchill address the nation. Pétain asked for peace. There is very heavy news coming from France, and I pity the brave French people on whom terrible misfortunes have fallen. Nothing will change our attitude toward it or shake our confidence that the genius of France will rise again. Whatever happens to France will not change our actions or our aims. We remain the sole defender of the world. We will do everything to be worthy of this high honor. We will defend our islands, and with the help of the British Empire, we will fight to the end until the curse of Hitlerism is wiped out. We are confident of our ultimate victory." These were the great words of a great man, prophetic words. But who then could say with certainty that everything would end well? It seemed utterly impossible. Anything could happen. To show a different kind of man, we will tell a little about the tall, fat man Hermann Göring, who made millions of Reichsmarks, running his fat paws into the coffers of huge firms like Krupp. But Hermann could be proud of his personal property, a small oil refinery near Hanover. In fact, it was a modern enterprise, not too big, but not too small. It could bring in enough money to allow Göring to update his closet every year. It is said that the fat marshal built a special barracks for his tailors, and above the door was his name written in letters 9 feet high. Naturally, this tidbit could not escape the gaze of the Bomber Command staffers. And in June 1940, the great day came when the 83rd Squadron gladly heeded the order to destroy it. We took off, overloaded to the brim to strike as hard as possible. 3 hours later, in the light of the full moon, we could clearly see the target. We circled around it like moths around a candle, waiting for the appointed time. Walt Disney himself couldn't have put on such a great show. Pete started it. We saw how he laid down on a combat course, strictly maintaining altitude, and his bombs rained down on the shops. Pieces of mangled metal flying in every direction. Then the other guys started bombing, and soon the production area turned into a solid mass of explosions. Buildings were catching fire one after another. 500 yards below us, it was like a huge bonfire had been lit. But Watty and I waited. I had my plan. Finally, when I thought all the guys had bombed out and turned for home, I turned off the engines and began silently gliding toward the oil storage tanks. They were left completely untouched, even though they were one of the most important parts of the plant. I decided to set them on fire. When we were at an altitude of only 300 feet, Watty began dropping bombs, trying to hit a different tank with each bomb. After a few seconds, a boom sounded and the tanks exploded. It was the most beautiful sight that man had ever seen, especially if he was the one who set off those fireworks, and the oil belonged to Hermann Göring. In the morning, I stopped by to see the officer, intelligence. Oscar had just finished writing his report. I noted that he had written, "Target destroyed." This struck me as odd, so I approached him. "What do you make of that, Oscar?" I asked. "A dang good fire. But there was no fire there when the boys flew off. That's why I held off." "We were bombing an oil storage tank," I said. "So when did you drop your bombs?" Oscar was suddenly interested. "At 1.25, I replied. "And I did the same time. On the same tanks." Here I laughed. "We both got the same idea at the same time, and we both dropped our bombs at exactly the same time. It's a miracle we didn't blow each other up." 3 weeks later, we learned from a secret but quite reliable source that Hermann Göring had moved his factory to East Prussia. Thus passed night after night. Parties were a thing of the distant past. Entertainment was out of the question. We all averaged 20 sorties a month, but although most of the operations were conducted at low altitude, losses were low. Disturbing raids on the Ruhr marshalling yards became almost daily. We tried to disrupt the German transportation system, but in each such raid sent only 6 planes, and therefore the losses from anti-aircraft fire were tangible. On one such night, Jack Kinnock, myself and Ross were sent to Zost. Oscar and 3 other pilots flew to Gelsenkirchen to try to destroy the traffic lights, the most vulnerable part of the railroad. We flew with open cockpits at an altitude of only 600 feet. Once over the Ruhr Valley, we turned left, found Lake Munn, and just 4 miles away was Zost. We dropped bombs from the same altitude, and nearly met our end. There were so many anti-aircraft guns there that it is simply incomprehensible how the Germans managed to cram them onto such a piece of land. I was almost killed. A shell tore off my left wing console. When I hastily spiked, several more shells hit the airplane, and one of them severed the steering rods. Coming out of the dive without rudders was very difficult. How we didn't crash into a tall house at a crossroads, I don't understand to this day. Waddy, sitting in the nose cockpit, thought we had hit it after all. I guess he was right. Our left engine took a hit too, and the oil pressure dropped to 40 psi. It could have failed at any time. In that case, with no rudders, we would have crashed immediately. The return trip turned into a real nightmare. Mac had already prepared to transmit an SOS as soon as I ordered it. In the event of a forced water landing, we could still hope to be picked up. However, all was bypassed, and we managed to land at the airfield. Our elevation rudders dangled helplessly. Rossi and Kinnock were less fortunate, having to bomb alternate targets. However, Oscar and the rest of the guys did a pretty good job elsewhere, although they had to pay for it. Their planes took a lot of hits. Someone in B formation was badly wounded and crashed the plane while trying to land it. In doing so, the entire crew was killed. The next night, we raided another city on the Baltic coast, Wismar. There was located one of the factories of the firm Dornier, producing seaplanes and bombers. Just before takeoff, the adjutant informed me that I had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. I vividly remember my feelings at that moment. It was a great pleasure to tell the lad such news. It so happened that our whole squadron went out and bombed the target, and not a single soul from 49 Squadron found the target. We were terribly proud, but with the arrival of new people, rivalry between squadrons somehow faded. The raid on Wismar resembled all the previous ones. We bombed from low altitude with the strongest opposition of light anti-aircraft guns. After we bombed off, I had to deal with the searchlights at the neighboring airfield. The hunt went well. Mac claimed to have shot 6 of them. When Pete and I got back, however, it turned out that both airplanes were just riddled and out of commission for a week. It was a memorable night, also because after we returned, a terrible argument broke out over who exactly lit the only fire on the airfield. One of the pilots, Sergeant Lister, who had never succeeded before, argued zealously that it was his bombs that had caused the fire. Today, I think he was probably right. The same thing happened in Aachen, Duren, Kassel, Amiens, and other cities with small military installations. Every night they were visited by half a dozen British bombers. Although the destruction was not too great, the crews were exhausted. Some guys were already beginning to suffer from nervous exhaustion and lack of sleep. It's very hard to get a good night's sleep in an ordinary officer's hotel where there's always someone in the bar throaty, doors slamming, and the ground staff singing loudly while shaving in the mornings. And guys who have spent all night in the air need a good night's rest. To somehow solve this problem, the command tried to settle pilots in the homes of local residents. For the same purpose was rented a large rural mansion. It was supposed that the pilots could sleep there, and there would be a kind of club. But many officers lived in rural estates scattered around the airfield. It so happened, though not entirely by chance, that Oscar, Rossi, Jack, Tony, and I were staying together with a very pleasant old lady whose name I cannot remember. She was tall, gray-haired, and superstitious. Her husband had long since passed away. Her house was one of the typical Lincolnshire estates, with its chapel and extensive grounds around it, but it was clear that the estate had known better days. I don't know what the old lady's financial situation was, but I noticed that she did some of the housework herself, and some of the armchairs were in obvious need of repair. The carpets were pretty shabby, too. But these were all small things. I admired her indomitable spirit that allowed her to maintain the estate. I'm afraid we weren't very good tenants. When we returned from our flights at night, we were usually highly agitated. Very often we would make a noise so loud that it would bring the whole estate to its feet. Very often we played in the garden, which involved a great deal of damage to it. It was hardly worthwhile to break a motorcycle through a thicket of rhododendrons. I soon discovered that the old lady was a true believer in spirits and the occult. We stayed up late one night talking about fears, beliefs, and other subtle matters until I completely lost the thread of the conversation. I had little knowledge of such subjects, but she could talk about them for hours. Finally, I yawned noisily and went to bed. But before I did, I had to agree with her that the house was haunted by ghosts who could be seen, who knew her by name, and who visited her from time to time. I had already seen death in all its guises in this world when it passed me by, and I had no intention of meeting it in the netherworld. So I took the candle and went up the stairs. It was an old house with no electricity, so I extinguished the candle and laid down, after which I thought for quite a while about what she had told me. But the fresh country air took its toll, and I fell asleep. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, I was awakened by something. I don't know what it was, but I hurriedly lit a candle and ran to the bathroom to get a glass of cold water. The summer night was quite hot. On occasions like this, I slept without pajamas, and now I went naked too. As I was returning from the bathroom, not the least bit embarrassed by my nakedness, my candle suddenly went out. I grabbed the railing and started to grope my way up the stairs. Suddenly, somewhere in the back of the house, there was soft, pleasant music. Someone was playing an organ. I froze, literally petrified. It was the same spirits. Then, as if someone had kicked me in the ass, I dashed to my room. I took 2 steps, and then I was flying somewhere. When the noise died down, I realized I'd rolled down the stairs. Groaning, I crawled upstairs again. Suddenly, a figure in a bonnet and an old-fashioned nightgown appeared at the top of the stairs. It was our old lady. In a gruff voice, she asked, "John, is that you again?" She gazed diligently into the darkness below. And now I was ashamed of my lack of clothes. I managed to explain that I wasn't John. Then she mercifully left her candle on the top step so I could get to my room. As I settled down again, Jack and Tony came in. They had just returned from a flight, and both had managed to knock back a few beers. "Beautiful organ round this church," Jack said, turning to Tony. "Yes, a very good one. I didn't realize you played so well." I pounced on them with my fists. So they were the ones playing the organ in the old chapel in the middle of the night, and at that time, I thought I was going mad. The next night, John bombed Lorian with a big lantern under his eye, trying his best to stay in this world and not slip into the other world. By early July, most of the bomber crews were almost completely exhausted. Fatigue was building up due to constant, night after night, sleep deprivation. Everyone became irritable. Quarrels broke out at the slightest occasion. Many of the boys, especially old Jack Kinnock, remembered the good old British tradition of grumbling. About the weather, about airplanes, about bombs, even about the war. We would have been much more alarmed, however, if we had realized what changes were gradually taking place in the very strategy of Bomber Command. Hitherto, we had done our best to support the Army's actions by launching massive strikes on military installations in the rear. However, France was now finished. Destroying military installations could no longer help the war effort, so slowly but surely the bombers began to switch to the infrastructure of Germany itself. This became a long-term policy. These coordinated strikes were to add up to a unified picture of a bombing offensive that was planned to be waged not for a year or two, but for about 4 years. So our plans changed. The Ministry of Economic Warfare held a series of meetings with the leadership of Bomber Command, and the latter sent orders to the commanders of air groups. Docks, oil storage tanks, ships and submarines were now to be bombed. In those dark days, it was the only way to conduct active operations against the Germans. They were soon supplemented by a host of other measures. On July 5, the Pétain government in Vichy severed diplomatic relations with Great Britain. All honest Frenchmen cursed him for this, for France was now also the target of air attacks. These people in Vichy were undoubtedly convinced that Britain's days were numbered, so they were ready to flirt with their German master. And as a result, French industry began producing equipment and armaments. Trucks, tanks, aircraft engines for the Reich. On a clear July night, the heavy rumble of many aircraft engines resounded in the skies over southern France. I was on one of the lead bombers. We had strict orders to exercise extreme caution to avoid civilian casualties. Our target was a truck factory on the Loire River. Since it was located at a considerable distance from the neighboring town, it seemed to us that we could easily accomplish our task without disturbing anyone. As we approached Nantes, I saw a sea of lights below, as in times of peace. No one here had thought of blackout. They had evidently not expected our appearance. Even later, when we went down the river and found our factory at some distance from Lorient, the picture was exactly the same. A multitude of lights were burning. Flying over the brightly lit area was pleasant. The scenery was in stark contrast to what we had seen in Germany and reminded us of the good old peaceful days. We circled over the target for a while, waiting for other airplanes to join us. From 2,000 feet, we could clearly see people running along the road around the factory, brightly lit by lanterns. We wondered why they weren't trying to take cover in shelters, since we could start bombing before they could hide. Someone even dropped a bomb in the river to warn them of the raid and get them to get away from the factory shops. The hint was understood. Panic broke out down below, and after about 20 minutes the factory lights began to go out one by one. Someone even opened machine gun fire on us. Soon the whole factory seemed to die out. After that we started bombing with a clear conscience. We never saw our bombs burst, which was a clear indication that they had fallen into the river. For the first time in his life, old Wadi missed. On the way back, we flew over Street Malo. Just 2 years ago, I had spent a wonderful summer vacation there, and now I just couldn't believe I was returning from a raid over French territory. Fortunately for the world, we were in a position to conduct such operations. The following night, several anti-aircraft guns appeared in the area. However, who stood at the sights? The French officers or the Nazis? I never found out. In any case, however, the firing was extremely inaccurate. When all targets in the area were destroyed, we shifted our efforts further south, to Bordeaux. 24 of our bombers attacked a local oil storage facility from low altitude, which then burned for 2 weeks. The gunner of the lead plane declared the target destroyed, but most pilots have learned by now not to trust the gunner's judgment because they tend to overestimate the results of a raid. After all, it is the pilot who writes the report and is responsible for its accuracy. I know of several fine examples where one pilot paid dearly for his mistake. He was in my squadron and was sent to attack a factory near Strasbourg. The flight was perfectly normal and everything was going fine. The target was covered by very few anti-aircraft guns, and the bombing was carried out from a very low altitude. As the plane turned back, the gunner reported seeing a column of sparks and flames 1,000 feet high and a falling factory chimney. The next day, the pilot was making a report and wrote, "Target destroyed." Afterward, he went to the bar to tip his morning beer. As he was having breakfast, the commander sent for him. He looked a bit pensive and said, "I know you did a great job, but why did you claim the target was destroyed upon your return?" There was no way the pilot could understand what the commander was saying. Then he added, "In your report you claim that the sparks and flames went up 1,000 feet, but why did your gunner just come in and say that you had brought back all the bombs except the napalm tank?" There are 2 lessons to be learned from this story. Never turn back until you are sure the bombs have actually been dropped. Never trust a gunner. Another time, when we attacked a Scharnhorst standing in dry dock at Kiel, Jack Kinnock dropped bombs from 16,000 feet. As he turned, the gunner reported seeing 2 direct hits in the tube area. One bomb exploded near the side of the ship at the dock, and another exploded in the water. Apparently, this guy had incredible eyesight. At the same time, we attempted to dive on this target with 2,000 armor-piercing bombs from 6,000 feet, but failed to distinguish anything at all. We made a total of 6 runs before someone was late in dropping the bomb. It crashed right in the center of Kiel. Of course, many citizens were killed in the explosion, but it was an unfortunate accident. We tried to prevent such incidents. That night we were very puzzled by one incident. We did not see a single barrage balloon, although such an important harbor should have been covered by a whole cloud. It was not until a week later that we realized why this was so. The Blenheim, flying at high altitude, had taken beautiful pictures of Kiel Harbor after our attack. It turned out that there was a gap 1/4 of a mile wide in the chain of barrage balloons. We were lucky enough to hit it. How it was formed, we never realized. Other pictures show the Scharnhorst took 6 hits with small bombs. Yeah, that gunner must have had an eagle's eye. Keeping up the pressure was much easier than any other operations, and everyone slowly began to calm down. We were due to make our sortie, followed by 2 days of rest. It was just great to get the opportunity to visit Lincoln again. The first night we relaxed, the second night we rested, and the third night we prepared for the flight. Mull, Rossi, and I would often visit the famous Theatre Royal in Lincoln, sit through the end of the first act, and then drink at the Crown until 10 p.m. A pleasant way to spend an evening, and not too bankrupt. Life went on a roll, and we began to feel like some sort of servants doing routine daily chores. The nervous tension eased little by little. The hysterical outbursts stopped. We began to feel happy again. Every night between 100 and 150 bombers left England to bomb the enemy. Their targets ranged from Denmark to southern France. The timing of these raids was spread out so that the bombing raids continued throughout the night. Therefore, the air raid sirens wailed continuously, which could cause disruptions in industry. For example, large rolling mills in the Ruhr had to be stopped and the furnaces extinguished. If the break was long, the ingot would harden right between the rolls. It took a lot of effort to get it out of there. Enemy night fighter aircraft simply didn't exist at that time. At least that's what we thought. In any case, they didn't know how to accurately detect our bombers and target them with fighters. But on the other hand, the fire of German anti-aircraft guns, as a rule, was very dense and accurate. This was probably a consequence of the serious efforts that the Germans made for 8 years to develop anti-aircraft artillery. One of their favorite tactics looked like this. The anti-aircraft guns would put an umbrella of fire over you and gradually lower it lower and lower. This forced the planes down to the ground, where they came within range of the small caliber machine guns. Here a searchlight could easily detect an airplane, and you could consider yourself very lucky if you didn't get a dozen hits. Even then, their noise detectors were very sensitive and often detected our planes even above the cloud layer. But no matter what, the losses during night raids remained very small and did not exceed 3.5%. On the other hand, the accuracy was also very small. Only a few bombs hit the target. As a result, both sides were satisfied. Whether it was good or bad, I don't know, but every night when the weather was good, the sirens started to wail in German cities. This was the case at Hamburg, where the Tirpitz was stationed, at Wilhelmshaven, where the Bismarck was sheltered, at Kiel, where the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau resided, and in many towns from Aachen to Frankfurt. On some occasions, when conditions were ideal, our airplanes did heavy damage. On other days, when dense clouds covered the sky, making it impossible to spot targets, bombs could burst a few miles away. The Germans began to build fake cities in which fake factories would begin to blaze during raids. Very often many tons of bombs would rain down on this decoy, while the German anti-aircraft guns fired hotly with the very real shells. But sometimes these fakes did us good. That's what happened near town X. This case looks absurd, but it really happened. The layout was built to right, 2 straight streets, 2 identical houses. We used it as a great reference point because we knew that the real town X was 18 miles to the southwest. The rest was, as they say, a matter of technique. These trips deep into Germany meant that we had to spend a lot of time over enemy territory, especially given the low speed of the Hamptons. Since we had no real navigational instruments, except sextants, which very few pilots knew how to use, we were often off course. Sometimes the errors were very gross. We either ran into strong nodes of defense or furrowed the sky in search of a target. To avoid such blunders, many tricks were devised, but the best was one. We knew which missile should be fired by a Luftwaffe plane in distress. If the enemy anti-aircraft guns opened fire on us, we immediately fired a red rocket, and all searchlights went out, and the anti-aircraft guns immediately silenced. You could assume that this trick would work a couple of times, but we used it for months. I think the explanation is very simple. At that time, the Luftwaffe in Germany were simply all-powerful, and jittery anti-aircraft gunners were terribly afraid to shoot down their own airplane. And that's why after the new George autopilots were installed on the airplanes, flying became a pleasant pastime. The pilot could sit and chew oranges while the gunner periodically fired 1 or 2 missiles. Toward the end of July, rumors spread that the Germans had concentrated a large amount of military equipment in storage facilities scattered throughout the Black Forest. Therefore, a plan was born to destroy these storages, and at the same time to try to deprive Hitler of his timber reserves. Scientists racked their brains and invented a new weapon. For some reason, they called it glitter. The glitter consisted of 2 6 by 6 inch square pieces of celluloid. In the middle was placed a piece of phosphorus wrapped in absorbent cotton. When the glitter was dropped on a tree or in dry grass, after about 15 minutes the absorbent cotton would dry out and the phosphorus would begin to smolder. It set the celluloid on fire, which literally burst into a hot flame in about 10 seconds. These sequins were always loaded in addition to the normal bomb load. Never once was a special raid planned using sequins alone. Most pilots were ordered to so choose their routes as to fly over the Black Forest or other forests in Germany. There they could drop sequins wherever they wished. In my opinion, this was not a good fiction. Soon our spies reported that several planes had made a navigational error and dropped glitter while flying over the center of cloud-covered Bremen. A batch of leaflets had been dropped on this city the previous night, so the inhabitants thought they were about to receive a new batch of British propaganda. Since everyone knew very well that the Gestapo was vigilantly watching them, the townspeople collected glitter in the streets and immediately put it in their pockets to read it at home. The result was amazing. Oscar, Rossi, and I had a big laugh when we heard about it. We were sitting on the lawn at our baronial estate when Jack Kinnock came in. "Hey guys, I'm being transferred." "To where?" Rossi asked. "To Cottesmore." It was a combat training unit. "Who else?" Oscar asked. "Just Sergeant Ollison and me. I don't know why. I guess they're giving me a rest or something." "Oh well, off to pack my suitcase. Big hello." With those words, Jack saddled up his moped and rolled into camp. Oscar said, "This is ridiculous. I'm not thinking about resting." I felt like we were obligated to keep going. "Me too." Oscar stood up. "I'll go try to find out what's really going on. Anyway, I'll clarify the assignment for tonight's flight. After all, if you're alert all the time and avoid areas with strong air defenses except over the target itself, I don't see why we can't make 100 sorties. What do you think, Rossi?" Rossi, in his characteristic Australian accent, replied, "I like high-altitude attacks, or very low altitude, but without a doubt, the most important thing is to stay on course." "Agreed," I put in. "But of course, the safest thing to do is to drop bombs from a dive. The only problem in this case is how accurately the gunner will determine where the bombs have fallen." Oscar agreed. "Yeah, in that case they're pretty accurate when they're shooting at you." Rossi laughed, probably remembering the guy in B Squadron who had bombed Strasbourg. "But seriously," Oscar continued, "if you're really a specialist at this game, anti-aircraft guns remain a serious danger. Well, there always remains the possibility of a lucky hit." "Yes, however, you'd have to be very lucky to hit me," Oscar said, lighting his pipe. While he was saying this, there came from the direction of Scampton the rumble of a terrible explosion, and then there rose a column of black smoke 3,000 feet high. My God, what happened out there? It's not an airplane. Let's go take a look. When we got to Scampton, we found that ground personnel had crawled out of the shelters. At first we thought they had been bombed, but later a calm woman from the Air Force Auxiliary told us what had happened. It turned out that 18 magnetic mines lying in the bomb bay had exploded. Rocks rained down from the sky for another 5 minutes after the explosion. It was the most powerful explosion I've ever heard. Just at this time, Hemswell had just conducted an attack with a force of 24 airplanes against an important military installation on the Ems Canal. They bombed from very low altitude. The raid was successful because they had succeeded in destroying one embankment, but they needed to destroy a second one on the Dortmund-Ems Canal as well. This canal, of course, was very vulnerable to air attack, and when Hemswell conducted the first raid, it was virtually defenseless. There was every reason to believe, however, that the Kroats would now install searchlights and a sufficient number of anti-aircraft guns there to prevent the possibility of a second raid. At that time, Scampton was the best base for our bomber group, so it was we who were given the task of destroying this important target. 2 teams were formed from mixed crews formed by both squadrons. One team consisted of Babe Leroyd, Pitcairn Hill, Joe, Oscar, and Mull. The other team consisted of 5 equally good pilots. The exercise was held on the canals in Lincolnshire, which were the same width as the bridge we were going to attack. Several models were molded out of plasticine, and we used them to scrutinize the terrain in the target area. During one of the training exercises, Mull and I switched planes at the last minute. I was legitimately proud of my bombardier Watty, and was pleased to see that he dropped his bombs exactly in the bullseye during the attack. During lunch I was seriously shocked when a gunnery officer came up to me and told me that I had dropped bombs on the beach so inaccurately that one of the bombs nearly took his leg off. But Mull was flying my plane. We continued training in the moonlight, and both teams achieved a high degree of coherence. By early August, everything was ready. Leroyd made a reconnaissance flight and found the air defense of the site to be quite strong. In his estimation, the attack should have been carried out either immediately or abandoned altogether. It so happened that I went on vacation to Cornwall when everything was ready. The raid took place on August 12, my birthday. While I was drinking beer with the country lads in a pub in Boscastle, Pitcairn, Leroyd, Mull, Rossi, and Matthews flew towards the target. Much has been written about this attack, but no one doubted that the pilots had acted with exceptional bravery. Pitcairn went to the target first and dropped bombs directly on the target. However, his plane was severely damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Rossi was next. He went to the target at low altitude, but the last thing the other pilots saw was a huge ball of flame on the ground. Poor old Rossi was dead. Mull was next. His left engine caught fire, but he managed to gain 2,000 feet altitude, allowing the entire crew to jump out with parachutes. Matthews was next and managed to drop his bombs accurately, although he had to return on one engine. The last to attack was Leroyd. Despite the blinding beams of searchlights, his bombardier managed to put the bombs right in the bullseye. The next day, a reconnaissance plane photographed the object. The raid was a complete success. The embankments were destroyed and the canal simply dried up. This was to cause the Germans serious problems in the water transportation system. Leroyd was awarded the Victoria Cross and Pitcairn received the Distinguished Service Order. When it was discovered that Mull had survived, the Distinguished Flying Cross was sent to him in a POW camp. This raid is notable for being the first in a whole system of similar operations. Selected crews were being trained for special missions, and the operation was being prepared by someone in flying command. But this was only the beginning.